Good morning and welcome to the Sunday morning sermon for January the 19th of 2025. And today we are looking at kind of a mission Sunday, a missions emphasis Sunday. And we're going to be talking about how we are to be like Jesus. One Sunday, as they drove home from church, a little girl turned to his mother or to her mother and said, "Mommy, there's something about the preacher's message this morning that I don't understand." The mother said, "Oh, dear, what is that?" The little girl replied, "Well, he said that God is bigger than we are. He said that God is so big that he could hold the whole world in his hand. Is that true?" The mother replied, "Yes, honey, that's very true." "But Mummy, he also said that God comes to live inside of us when we accept Jesus as our Savior. Is that true too?" Again, the mother assured the little girl that what the preacher had said was very true. Then, with a puzzled look on her face, the little girl asked, "Well, if God is bigger than us and he lives in us, wouldn't he overflow and show through?" Isn't that the point? That's the point, isn't it? If we're Christians, when people see us, Jesus ought to overflow and show through in our homes, in our offices, in our communities, in every aspect of our lives. Jesus ought to show through. Listen to these words from the Apostle Paul from 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 18. He writes, "And we who reflect the Lord's glory are being transformed into his likeness." Now, I want to call your attention to two ideas mentioned in that verse. First of all, we who are Christians are supposed to reflect Jesus. In other words, when people see us, they should be able to see Jesus in us, in what we say, in what we do, and how we act. Secondly, with each passing day, we ought to become more and more transformed to be like Jesus, become more and more like him. And again, that is to be evident in what we do and what we say every day. So let me ask you, how would things be different if Jesus were to come and take your place today? Would anything be different as you get ready to go to church? What if he took over your job during the week? Or teenager, what if he sat in your desk at school? Or what if he took my place in the pulpit? Whether we realize it or not, that is exactly the idea he wants, to make himself known to others through our lives. You see, as Christians, our goal should be to introduce Jesus to others and others to Jesus, to make Jesus known in this world. We should want everyone who doesn't know Jesus now to come to love him, to discover the hope and the joy and the power he can bring into their lives. Being like Jesus. Let me just touch on a couple of points here. First of all, we are to look like Jesus. Now, if that's ever going to happen, people must be able to see Jesus in us. But the eyes of so many people today have been clouded by the master of this age. Their vision has been polluted by the trappings of this world and the moral decay that surrounds us. So how are we ever going to have people see Jesus? Well, if they're going to see Jesus, they'll have to see Jesus in us. That's why Paul is challenging us to reflect Jesus in our lives by being transformed into his likeness. We must be seen as being like Jesus. The last little while, I watched a few items on television concerning the death of Jimmy Carter and his funeral and what people had to say about this peanut farmer from Plains, Georgia. And they talked about his faith and how important his faith was to him and how he wanted to share that with others. What does it mean to look like Jesus? Well, I'm confident you realize that I'm not talking about growing a beard or wearing a certain kind of clothing. Instead, it means to be like Jesus, to be like him, is to imitate the character and the nature and the attitudes of Jesus. In fact, in Ephesians chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, that is exactly what the Apostle Paul urges the early Christians and us to do. He says, "Be imitators of God, therefore, as dearly loved children, and live a life of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God." Be imitators of Christ. What a bold challenge that is, that we are challenged to undertake becoming like Christ. By the way, when people look at Jesus, what do they see? Well, they see a Jesus who is generous with his time and his love and his power. They see one who is genuine in his care and his compassion and his commitment to the will of God and his commitment to others. But let's pause for a moment and consider, what do people see when they look at us? Do they see us as being generous in the same way that Jesus was? Do they see us as being genuine about our faith and our commitments? People also looked at Jesus and saw him to be incredibly receptive. He would welcome people who approached him, the intelligent and the illiterate, the childlike and the childish, the prosperous and the impoverished. He dedicated the dedicated and the desperate, the seeker and the sick. He had such an open door to his heart that he was called not a teacher of sinners or a changer of sinners. That's not what they called him. He was called a friend of sinners. What better friend could anyone have than to have Jesus? And what kind of friend do sinners find in us? Again, do we look like Jesus? Do our lives and our hearts and our nature reflect his glory? Are we imitating him? Do we make Jesus known by imitating him? By looking like him? Secondly, we are to sound like Jesus. Our goal is to introduce people to Jesus, and then we must begin to sound like Jesus. When people heard Jesus speak and teach, they were amazed. Look at this passage from Luke's Gospel, chapter 4, verses 36 and 37. In its context, this is found just following a scene where Jesus had driven a demon out of a man in the synagogue. It says, all the people were amazed and said to each other, "What is this teaching? With authority and power, he gives orders to evil spirits and they come out. And the news about him spread throughout the surrounding area. People were talking. A modern translation, The Message, phrases it this way: Jesus was the talk of the town. Anytime Jesus walked into the synagogue or the market or someone's home, people talked. His comments, his teachings, his rebukes, his words of love had people talking. Who is this Jesus? Oh, there were people who didn't like to hear Jesus. But for the most part, they were the rulers and the leaders who were desperately trying to maintain their control over people's lives and their loyalty. And there are people today who don't want others listening to Jesus, because when people listen to Jesus, questions are raised, hearts and lives are changed. In 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 23, the Apostle Paul tells us, when they hurled insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. So our task is to help make Jesus known by sounding like him. 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 12 and 13, the Apostle Paul says, when we are cursed, we bless. When we are persecuted, we answer kindly. Our vocabulary, our conversations, our prayers, our stories, they all must echo the love of Christ, the compassion and the care of Christ. Our message must be a testimony of hope and change that encourages those who know us to want to know Jesus too. And they will only hear his words if we somehow begin to sound as Jesus sounds. If they're ever going to hear the story of love and care, the love of Christ, they must hear it from us. We are to sound like Jesus. And then finally, we are to act like Jesus. If we're ever going to introduce people to him, then we must also act like Jesus. John chapter 13, we see our Lord wrapping himself in a towel, washing the feet of his disciples, demonstrating the heart and the actions of a servant. Listen to what Jesus says in verses 12 through 17, as paraphrased in the Message. After he had finished washing their feet, he took his robe, put it back on, and went back to his place at the table. Then he said, "Do you understand what I have done to you? You're addressed to me as teacher and master, and rightly so you address me that way. That is what I am. So if I, the master and teacher, washed your feet, you must now wash each other's feet. I've laid down a pattern for you. What I've done, you do. I'm only pointing out the obvious. A servant is not ranked above his master. An employee does not give orders to the employer. If you understand what I'm telling you, act like it. Live a blessed life. If you understand what I'm telling you, Jesus says, then act like it. The person who trusts in Jesus will do what he is doing, and even greater things, because Jesus intercedes with the Father for us to make that possible. We're called to act as he did, to share God's promises, to teach others about God's kingdom, to serve and to meet the needs of others, to love people with our hearts and with our hands. We're to bring people into God's presence, to help them find healing, to point them to God's sacrifice on the cross, and to help them find salvation in Him. Some years ago, I heard an interesting story about a young boy living in Paris at the end of World War II. He had been orphaned by the atrocities committed by the German forces. And now he's alone. He's having to scrounge around the ruined city as best he can to find food and clothing and shelter. But nearly everyone was experiencing desperate times, and he found that people either ignored him or had nothing to give him. Years before, he had heard someone talk about God and Jesus. But with the hell on earth that the war had brought into his life, he had long since lost what meager faith he had had before. One cold morning, he was wandering down the street, staring into the windows of the shops and the cafes, and he stopped outside the window of a small bakery. The smell of fresh bread made his stomach ache with pain. He was absorbed by the smell of the bakery, so absorbed that he didn't realize that a soldier had come up behind him and was watching him. The boy had hardly noticed when the soldier walked past him into the store. He did, however, notice the large bag the baker was filling for the man with rolls and bread and pastries, and the boy could hardly breathe when the soldier exited the shop, knelt down in front of him, and handed him the bag. He looked at the soldier with astonishment and gratefulness. Finally, he asked the question that was running through his mind, "Mister, are you Jesus?" To be mistaken for Jesus. What a bold and daring thing to have our actions so remind others of what Jesus is about and what Jesus would do. But then again, shouldn't that be our goal? Shouldn't that be our goal? To be more like Jesus. God bless. Have a wonderful day, and until we meet again, let's continue to exchange prayers daily.